The Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's one of those topics that's just so incredibly complex and, let's be honest, deeply emotional. So in this explainer, we're going to try to cut through some of that noise. We'll trace the key moments, the core issues, and really dig into why peace has been so hard to find.
And really, it all boils down to this, right? How has this fight over a piece of land smaller than New Jersey gone on for more than 100 years? It seems almost impossible. That's the question we're going to unpack.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the fundamental issue, two peoples, one land. Then, we'll jump back in time from the British Mandate to what's known as the Nakba. After that, we'll cover the era of occupation and uprisings. Then, we'll break down the major roadblocks to peace, the really sticky issues. And finally, we'll try to understand why, even today, a solution seems so far away.
All right, let's dive into part one. At its absolute heart, this whole thing isn't just about lines on a map. It's about two national movements who look at the exact same piece of earth and both say, that is our home.
So on one side you have Zionism. This is the belief that the Jewish people have a right to self-determination, to have their own state in their ancient historical homeland. And on the other side you have Palestinian nationalism, which is the belief that the Arab people living in that same land, what they call Palestine, have a right to their own sovereign state. The problem? Both groups see their claim as absolutely essential to who they are, to their very survival. And that's the core clash.
Okay, so how did this clash actually ignite? To understand that, we have to go back to the early 20th century, a time when empires were falling and new powers were drawing new lines in the sand. It really starts picking up steam in the late 1800s, as the Zionist movement encourages more Jews to immigrate. But the real game changer was 1917 and something called the Balfour Declaration. You see, Britain basically made two promises that couldn't both be kept. They supported a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, but at the same time promised to protect the rights of the Arabs already living there. Talk about setting the stage for conflict. Fast forward to 1947, Britain basically throws its hands up, gives the problem to the new United Nations, and the UN comes back with a radical idea. Just split the land in two.
And the reactions to this plan? Well, they could not have been more different. The Jewish leadership said yes. For them, this was the dream becoming reality. When Israel declared its independence in 1948, the war that followed was, in their eyes, a fight for their very existence, their war of independence. But the Arab leaders flat out rejected the plan. They saw it as the UN unfairly giving away land that belonged to the Arab majority. For them, the war was about defending their home from a massive historical injustice.
And the result of that 1948 war was, well, it was a cataclysm. This number you see here, around 700,000, represents the number of Palestinians who either fled their homes or were forced out. They became refugees overnight, kicking off a crisis that is still at the very center of the conflict today.
And for Palestinians, this event has a name, the Nakba. It's the Arabic word for catastrophe. And it's not just a historical event, it's a deep, foundational trauma in their collective identity, the moment their society was fractured and their hopes for a state were crushed. You really can't understand the Palestinian perspective without understanding the Nakba.
So 1948 wasn't the end, not by a long shot. In fact, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. The decades that followed would see more major wars and massive popular uprisings that would change the face of the conflict entirely.
The next huge shift happens in 1967. In the Six-Day War, Israel captures the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and that's when the military occupation begins. This new reality eventually leads to the First Intifada, a huge Palestinian uprising in 1987. Then in the 90s, there was this glimmer of hope, the Oslo Accords, but they fell apart. By 2007, the militant group Hamas takes over Gaza, which leads to this brutal cycle of violence, all culminating in the horrific attack on October 7, 2023, and the all-out war that erupted right after.
Let's pause on that word for a second, occupation. When you hear it in this context, it's referring specifically to Israel's military control over the West Bank and Gaza, which started way back in 1967. For Palestinians living there, the occupation isn't an abstract concept. It's the daily reality that shapes their lives, and it's their number one grievance.
And that brings us to Intifada. It literally means shaking off in Arabic, and it describes these huge, widespread Palestinian uprisings against that occupation. The first one, in the 80s, was known more for civil disobedience and protests. The second, in the early 2000s, was much, much more violent. But both were these powerful, raw expressions of a people trying to, well, shake off Israeli rule. And as we just saw on the timeline, this conflict took its latest and arguably most brutal turn on October 7, 2023. That was the day Hamas fighters stormed out of Gaza,
killing around 1,200 people inside Israel. It was, without a doubt, the single deadliest day in the country's history, and it's what triggered the devastating war we're seeing today.
Okay, so that's the history, the path that led us here. But now, let's zoom in on the specific issues, the nuts and bolts, that have made a final peace deal feel just out of reach for so long. Peace negotiators often call these the final status issues. Think of them as the four giant mountains that any agreement has to find a way to climb over. You've got borders. What would a Palestinian state actually look like? Jerusalem. Who gets control of the holy city? Refugees. What happens to the millions of descendants of those who fled in 1948? And finally, security. How do you make both sides actually feel safe?
When we talk about borders, the biggest roadblock, literally, is the issue of Israeli settlements. These are Israeli towns and cities built on land in the West Bank that was captured in '67. For Palestinians, it's simple. They see this as a land grab that carves up their territory and makes a functional, connected Palestinian state almost impossible. And then there's Jerusalem. This one is just loaded with emotion. Both Israelis and Palestinians claim it as their capital. It's also home to some of the most sacred sites in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. The question of how to share it or divide it, it might be the single most explosive issue on the table.
Next up is the right of return. This is a core Palestinian demand. It's the idea that the refugees from 1948 and all their descendants, we're talking millions of people now, should have the right to go back to their families' old homes. But for Israel, this is an absolute non-starter. They believe it would mean the end of a Jewish majority state. So you can see why this is viewed as an existential threat by both sides.
And finally, security. This is where you see the fundamental paradox of the conflict. Israel says we need absolute guarantees that a Palestinian state won't be a base for attacks against us. But Palestinians say, how can we ever be secure as long as we're living under Israeli military control? So what one side needs to feel safe is the very thing that makes the other feel oppressed.
So that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. When you put all these incredibly difficult issues together, you start to see why the conflict feels so stuck. What are the deeper forces keeping everyone in this deadlock? Well, it really boils down to a few key things. First, you have generations of violence that have created this incredibly deep-seated mistrust and trauma on both sides. This leads to what's called a zero-sum mentality, the belief that if you gain something, I must have lost something. Add to that the fact that the political leadership on both sides is really fragmented, which often gives extremists a veto over any kind of compromise. And finally, the facts on the ground, like the expanding settlements, make the idea of a two-state solution look less and less realistic with each passing year. And this really gets to the psychological core of the whole thing. The Palestinian experience is defined by decades of being displaced, of living under occupation. The Israeli experience is defined by a long history of persecution that peaked with the Holocaust. Because of these deep collective traumas, what one side sees as a legitimate act of self-defense, the other can only see as a brutal act of aggression. It's a tragic, vicious cycle.
And that leaves us right back where we started, facing a really tough question. With the realities on the ground becoming more and more entrenched, with generations of trauma built up on both sides, what could a path to a just and lasting peace even begin to look like? That is the question that continues to haunt this land and, frankly, the entire world.